Welcome back to Scripture and Scholarship. I am your host, Payman Solar, and today we are asking a question that sounds simple but has divided scholars for decades. Was Jesus actually buried? A very important question. And now, I want to be very clear about what we are not debating today. Nearly every scholar, Christian, skeptic, atheist, Jewish, doesn't matter, agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is the most certain fact in the historical Jesus records. And we are not even asking whether the resurrection is real, whether Jesus was raised from the dead, and that's theology and faith, but it's not history, right? Our point today is historical point. What we are asking is this: after Jesus died on the cross, was his body taken down and placed in a tomb, or was it left on the cross to decay, dumped in a common grave, and lost to history? So it seems very obvious to us. But when you get to read some scholarship, you realize that there are different perspectives on this question. And here's why I think it matters. If Jesus was never placed in an identifiable tomb, then the story of a woman finding it empty on the Sunday morning has nothing to be empty of. The burial isn't just detail, it's a foundation on which the entire empty tomb tradition rests. For the next 15 minutes or so, we are going to survey how 4 different camps of scholars approach this question. And I promise the answer isn't as obvious as the gospel make it sound for us. So let's get to scholarly view here. But let me start by laying out the historical data for us. Scholars who work on this question are drawing from 4 main sources. When they come to the question, our main sources of information about the burial of Jesus are kind of 4 sources for us. The first one, Roman crucifixion practice. Crucifixion wasn't just about death. It was about humiliation, and the major part of that humiliation was denying the body of the burial. The body was left on a cross to rot, to be eaten by scavengers, dogs, whatever. These serve as a public warning. This is what happens if you defy Rome. We have Roman sources. We confirm this standard because there was such a source. Petronius described it. Roman legal code, the Digest of Justinian, makes it very explicit that crucified criminals were regularly left hanging on cross. And second evidence that we have is Jewish burial law and custom according to Old Testament. Now here's where things get very complicated. Jewish law, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verses 22 to 23, actually reads like this. Says the body of the executed must be buried before sunset. Why? Because an exposed body defiled the land. So you had this tension. Roman policy wanted bodies left up. Jewish demanded they came down. They should come down. We have evidence of that, this kind of tension in Josephus' writing. A Jewish historian writing in the end of first century explicitly says the Jews were so concerned with this burying the dead that they took down even crucified bodies before sundown. And we have archaeology to back this up in 1968 or 69. At a place called Gifha Mitva, I guess, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, discovered the ossuary, that's the bone box of a crucified Jewish man named Yehohanan. His heel bone still had the iron nail through it. He was crucified and he was given a proper burial. So now the third group, the gospel. What the Gospels actually tell us about burial. All 4 canonical Gospels that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them, report essentially the same story. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of Sanhedrin, that was the council that condemned Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for the body, and Pilate granted it. Joseph took Jesus down, wrapped him in a linen cloth, and the place him in the new tomb. The Matthew said new tomb. And the fourth sources, Paul's letter, especially letter to Corinthians. In the 1 Corinthians 15, written around 52 to 55 CE, only about 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul quotes what a scholar believes is an earlier creed, maybe from within just a few years after the event. And it says Jesus was buried. That's in verse 4. Atemphe in Greek. He was buried. So now we have Roman practice saying no burial, Jewish law saying burial required, gospel accounts saying burial happened, and Paul's early creed saying Jesus was buried. So now you have to decide, okay, what evidence you think you can trust. The scholarly disagreement comes down to which of these do you trust, and how do you weigh them against each other? And I think that's a very puzzling and that's very interesting question. So now I am going to share this different perspective of scholarly opinion and perspective when it comes to burial of Jesus. Is it really happened or is it not happened? According to, if you go with the Roman practice, you should be very skeptical. If you go with the gospel, you should accept that. But let me start by saying this. The most skeptical camp, the view in this foreview that we have today, is probably the most influential voice of this camp is the person by the name of John Dominic Crossan that everybody knows. John Dominic Crossan was a former Catholic priest, a founder of something called Jesus Seminar, and one of the most widely read historical Jesus scholars of the last 50 years. His work is a serious scholarship. I highly recommend, if you never pick up anything from John Dominic Crossan, start reading his stuff. He's a great scholar. Crossan's argument is straightforward. He says Roman practice was standard. Crucified people did not get buried. The post-mortem denial of burial, leaving the body exposed, was part of terror. It was the punishment even after death. So Crossan argues that the story of Joseph of Arimathea, this is very interesting. Joseph of Arimathea, according to Crossan, is a literally invention by Mark. So the earliest gospel writer, he thinks that was completely invented by Mark. It was created to solve a narrative problem that we have. How do you get from a crucifixion to resurrection? You need a tomb to be empty. So you invent Joseph, a wealthy disciple who gives Jesus a proper burial in a fine tomb. Interesting. What actually happened? Crossan is stark about this. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing this most famous line that he wrote, that the historian has to reckon with the likelihood that Jesus' body was either left on the cross to be eaten by scavenger birds, or at best to shallow trench, grave where dogs would dig it up. Kind of. He frames this as a horror that early Christian eventually transformed into something noble, a burial by a rich follower. He is very, very skeptical when it comes to this question. His dialogue partner, another guy by the name of Marcus Borg, another person in Jesus Seminar, a major Jesus scholar. Sorry, I come to Ehrman yet. Borg actually takes the similar but soft, kind of more softened kind of line. He treats the burial as a theological construction, and it's genuinely agnostic. And he said, we don't know what happened to the body physically. He's less committed to scavengers, birds, and dogs pictured than Crossan. But he's equally skeptical that the gospel burial account is historical. Now, here's something important to note. This view is very, minority position in scholarship, even among non-Christian and non-critical scholars. Most scholars, even a skeptical one, do not agree with Crossan on this point. But it's the loudest skeptical voice, and it sharps a lot of popular discussion out there, mostly in the internet. So now we are moving from the second kind of group, agnostic or a skeptical view. So the second camp is slightly different. These scholars don't make a strong positive claim that Jesus wasn't buried. Instead, they say we cannot know. There is no way of knowing. The evidence is too ambiguous. The most important figures here is the guy by name of Bart D. Ehrman, probably the most visible New Testament scholars in today's America. He writes best-selling books, does interview debates with Christians like online, and he's changed his mind in this question, which is very interesting, even publicly, which is worth noting. So in his earlier work in 1990s, if I'm not mistaken about the date of the book, Ehrman accepted Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus and that the empty tomb was historical. But by 2014, in his book, How Jesus Became God, he has reversed himself and changed his mind on that. Here's the new argument. First, Roman left crucified bodies on the crosses for days as deterrent. This was standard practice. Second, Pilate, the prefect who condemned Jesus, was brutal. The gospel tried to soften him. They show him washing his hand, reluctant, but the real Pilate, according to Philo and Josephus, was harsh and politically crazy. Why would he do a Jewish council member a favor? Joseph of Arimathea. Third, this is the key, I think, that Ehrman notes that early Christian storytellers had every reason to invent the burial story. Without known tomb, there is no tomb to be discovered empty. Without an empty tomb, the resurrection narratives lost their narrative punch. So the burial was invented to make the empty tomb story work. To me, it's kind of similar to what Crossan actually argues here. And the fourth, Joseph of Arimathea, is presented in Mark, according to Ehrman, as a literary character. His function is to produce the tomb, but Ehrman treats him as a Markan creation. So it seems to me like Crossan. Now Ehrman's conclusion is careful, I guess. He doesn't say Jesus definitely wasn't buried. He says he no longer thinks the burial is relatively certain historical data. And in fact, he thinks both the burial and empty tomb are unlikely. Another scholar in this camp goes more further, takes the stronger position, Greg Lüdemann. He argues the burial tradition is simply unhistorical. Jesus' body decayed in the common pit, and the resurrection appearances were visionary experiences triggered by grief. This is what Lüdemann actually argues. And there is one more figure I should mention for completeness. Richard Carrier. I don't have a picture of him, because, he's a mythicist who argued that Jesus never existed at all. I'm mentioning him because he occasionally show up in this kind of discussion and debate, but his position is rejected by virtually every credentialed New Testament scholar that I know, including Ehrman himself. I won't spend time on it. So the agnostic camp, Ehrman's camp, is influential in popular discussion because Ehrman is famous, but in the academic literature, if you attend like SBL, places like that, it's minority position. Most of the scholars, even very skeptical one, think we have enough evidence to say that the burial is probably historical. So this is the different camp. So the first camp was like Crossan and Borg, and second camp like Ehrman and Lüdemann. And we come to the mainstream critical view. These camp are probably the most important camp, I would say, and bring us to the third camp, which is actually the dominant position in academic New Testament studies. These are scholars who use rigorous critical methods. They are skeptical. They don't assume the gospel are reliable, but they conclude that burial story has a solid historical core, which is interesting. So this third camp, I would say the most influential voice of this camp is the guy that I love, Raymond Brown, a Catholic priest, one of the greatest New Testament scholars of 20 centuries. Brown wrote what is still the most exhaustive treatment of the Passion, I would argue. It's called The Death of the Messiah. 2 huge volumes, published in 1994, I guess. And the burial section gets 112 pages. I just checked today. It was fascinating. Brown's conclusion is this. The burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea, it's very probable historically. And here's the reason behind it. Joseph, according to Brown, it said Joseph is a member of Sanhedrin. He is the body that condemned Jesus. So why would anyone invent a Sanhedrin member who acts with respect toward Jesus' body? It makes no sense, he said, theologically. You would invent a royal follower, like secret disciple from among the 12. You wouldn't invent a council member. So I think it just makes sense if you think it. So Brown argues that Joseph is acting out of legal obligation, according to Deuteronomy 21, 23 to 22 to 23, not out of personal devotion. The later gospel writers like Matthew and John turn him into a devout follower, but the earliest tradition has him simply doing his duty as a council member. So another person in this camp that respected scholars, another Catholic scholar, John Meier, major scholar who's spent decades studying historical Jesus, applies his rigorous criteria for authenticity, multiple sources, embarrassment, dissimilarity, and he concludes that the burial passes all of them. It's well attested, and the figure of Joseph is embarrassing enough a Sanhedrin member that it passes the embarrassment test. You don't invent embarrassing details. So both of these Catholic scholars actually accept the burial, and they're very, to them is very probable. So, and the third one, now Allison. Allison is the most careful voices on this question. He surveys every major argument on both sides and comes to a very characteristically, I would say, cautious conclusion. Joseph's burial is probably historical, he argues, but he's genuinely uncertain about the empty tomb itself. And here's what makes Allison credible even to a skeptic. He is willing to say, I don't know. He doesn't pretend to certainty he doesn't have. That honesty makes his work the most respected single treatment of the question among scholars across entire spectrum. So, makes sense, the argument that Allison made here. So another scholar, Vermes, a late Jewish scholar who was respected by anyone, Christians and non-Christian, accepted that the burial as probably historical. His argument was grounded in the Jewish law. It would have been implausible for a crucified Jew on the eve of Passover to be left on the cross overnight. That would violate Jewish sensibility too sharply, he argues. So the mainstream critical view says, yes, Joseph probably buried Jesus, but Mark may have, embellished the story. Mark says Joseph was a respected member of the council seeking the kingdom of God. That sounds like a believer. The earlier tradition probably just had him as a council member doing his job, his duty. The follower part is a theological coloring, it seems. This view by Brown, Meier, and Allison and Vermes is a dominant view in academic New Testament scholarship today, not just among conservative, but among even agnostic and a skeptic too. Whence, in the life of Jesus, it's highly probable, maybe even certain. The most sustained scholarly defense comes from N.T. Wright. Tom Wright, former Bishop of Durham, brilliant New Testament scholar. His work on resurrection of the Son of God is like roughly 800, 900 pages. It's a massive work. And his argument for the burial is structural, just evidential. Wright argues that the earliest Christian belief was specifically bodily resurrection. Here's the thing. Within first century Judaism, resurrection always meant the bodily raising of the corpse at the end time. It never meant something disembodied or spiritual. So if Jesus' body was known to be decomposing in a grave somewhere, how could early Christians have called his resurrection resurrection? The language would have been nonsensical. You can't resurrect a body that is still dead in the grounds. For the claim of bodily resurrection to make any sense at all, the body had to be gone. It had to be placed somewhere, a tomb, and then the tomb had to be empty. So Wright also points out about some of the stuff that we discussed today. about the gospel burial accounts contain features that are hard to explain as a later invention. Kind of responding. Women are primarily witness to the burial. In the first century Jewish law, women's testimony in court was considered less reliable than men's. Why invent women as your witnesses? You would invent male disciple. So the presence of women suggests the tradition is earlier than literally invention. So the question about Joseph of Arimathea, he actually argues about Joseph like this. He said he is very awkward character. He's from Sanhedrin, the body that condemned Jesus. He's not one of the 12. That awkwardness, he argues, suggests historicity, not invention. So that's his argument. So another guy, Craig Evans, a conservative but serious scholar, I would say, wrote what widely considered the strongest direct response to Bart Ehrman burial skepticism. Evans makes 4 points here. First, a Roman may have left bodies on crosses in general, but in Judea, the prefect accommodate Jewish sensibility to keep the peace, especially around festival. Evans cites Josephus, who explicitly says the Jewish took down even crucified before sundown. He just respond to a book that Ehrman wrote by the title of How Jesus Became God. He and some other evangelical scholars respond to Ehrman books, and you can find it very interesting. Second point, Pilate's political situation in Jerusalem, he argues, by the time of Jesus was serious. He would clash with Jewish leadership repeatedly, so he would have had every political reason to grant Joseph's request, especially on the eve of Passover. Third, Joseph isn't random, he argues. He is a council member. Under Jewish law, the Sanhedrin was responsible for arranging burial of the executed. Joseph is exactly the figures you would expect to handle this, not an invented disciple. So, and fourth, archaeology, the Yahuhanan ossuary proves that crucified Jews could be and were buried in the first century. This isn't a speculation, it's physical evidence. I mean, that's his main argument. So, and then we come to William Lane Craig, a philosopher theologian, adds that there is no competing burial tradition in any first or second century source. If Jesus was buried somewhere else, or not buried at all, you would expect some alternative story to survive, but there isn't one. Every source says Joseph buried him. Mike Licona, building on minimal facts approach, treats the burial as historically probable, and Gary Habermas, who developed the minimal facts framework, includes the burial as one of the historically best attested events in the life of Jesus. So these are the scholars that I would call them conservative. So the conservative camp sees the burial as solid history. So what's the answer? Was Jesus buried? Based on the historical evidence that documented for us that we have today, the Jewish law, the archaeological finds, the early creedal material, I would say this after reading all of these sources. The burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea is probably historical, not certain, but probably. That's where the most scholars across the skeptical to faithful spectrum, I would say, they land. The empty tomb is a separate and more contested question, but the burial itself, the weight of evidence, I would say, supported. But there is what I really want you to take away. This is how scholarship works. We have sources, we weight them, we note where they agree and where they disagree. We listen to a strongest argument on different camps, and then we make a judgment call. And if you want to see the strongest version of the debates head to head, the 2014 books by Bart Ehrman and Craig Evans, How Jesus Became God and How God Became Jesus, is a place to look. They respond to each other directly. They would both accessible, I would say, and you get the sharpest argument on each side. If you like the video, like it, make a comment, and thank you for watching.